from within, nor did lights of joviality come forth from its large gray windows. For all intents and purposes, it was as silent and welcoming as the grave. The house had no neighbors, unless you can count the toads and bats of the surrounding woodland as fellow men. The crumbling and decaying property stood alone in the horrid dark of deepest gunner's cloth, a large and foreboding patch of woodland on the outskirts of haunted Barton. It had no claim to fame, and as a haunted house, it was overshadowed by the nearby mythical Byron Manor, a home for the mentally disturbed that also nestled among the sloping bungalows of the small village. Yet, those who did know of the house were aware of the magic that soaked into its every foundations and spread into the soil around the property. Like a crawling plague, this miasma poisoned the whole area with a sick, creeping ambience. Many could feel this unseen necromancy on a primal, instinctive level, and were alerted by whatever feral defenses remained in the human brain to avoid the house at all costs. Rare bleak souls such as myself were instead attracted to that same sorcery like a moth to a candle flame, and sought to be ever closer to that spark of magic, no matter how much it burned. By good fortune, purchasing the house had been a simple affair. Whatever family had once possessed it had long relinquished all claims, and the estate had instead passed into the remit of the local parish council, who had no objections about selling it on to me. The last scion of that decaying dynasty had left instructions that should no family heir make himself known, the house would become the property of the town council, who were to keep it for a period of 20 years, after which they could do as they please. Most likely they would have demolished it had I not come along. A fair bit of money must have been left in the hands of the council in order to keep the property from such destruction. Certainly none of it had been spent on the building's upkeep. For decades, the house had stood alone and unoccupied, quietly crumbling as it struggled to keep vigil over the encroaching wilderness that threatened to engulf it. But no longer. It would be mine, and once I had died and been interned in the property, it would pass to another of my family. It would stay with me and my kin, and if none came forth to claim the house at the time of my death, my instructions were to have it pulled down, brick by brick, forever mine and mine alone. Perhaps I should enlighten the reader as to my demeanor, in hope that it shall shed some light on why someone such as I would wish to buy and indeed live in such a lonely place as the Gunner's Cloth House. I had lived in the village of Barton for my entire life, only leaving the village as a youth to attend Eastwich College, before moving on to Manchester to finalize my studies. However, no matter how far I strayed from the place of my birth, I could never fully leave it behind in my mind. There were far too many memories, both good and ill, attached to that place. Dreams of summers spent running around the plentiful woodlands and the cramped crooked alleys that snake around the living abodes of Barton's residents. I would often make a trip to Barton on my free days, taking the train to Eastwich and then boarding the bus to the village, watching out the window for persons familiar to me. There were often many of these, for Barton had within it a rather peculiar magic that seemed to prevent most of its population from moving beyond its reach and into the greater world outside. It was during one of my many sojourns into Barton that I first came across the house. I had known since I was a child that there was supposedly a haunted house deep in Gunner's Cloth, but never set eyes upon it until I was an adult. No, it was only a few years ago that I made the pilgrimage into the woods, past the old stream that was now little more than a black sticking slough, past the curious worn gray stones that the old-timers called the pixie thrones, and finally beneath the ivory-strangled witch elms that shaded the acrid brown earth where nothing ever truly grows, until finally I stood before the house in horrid, silent awe. The greasy gray windows and boarded-up door called to me, and I knew that I was finally home. The house had called to me, and I felt as if I had always known it. I had come face to face with a legend whose story was only half remembered in hushed whispers by those Barton folk who were themselves not long for this world. My interest in death and haunted houses had stemmed, as most deficiencies of the mind do, from early childhood experiences and associations. I had personally witnessed 2 family deaths before I was 12 years old. First, watching my grandmother waste away from alcohol consumption until her organs dried up and failed her, and losing my dear friend and cousin, who had hanged himself in his own home, without so much as a word of goodbye, or a letter to explain why. By age 15, I had become increasingly afflicted with nightmares of my own death. Vivid dreams depicted my demise on a weekly and eventually nightly basis. Despite their fevered frequency, I failed to capture many details about my death dream, for the vividness eroded with the merciful clarity of the waking mind. The place and time of my death remained unknown to me during these nocturnal harrowings. But curiously, I grew to learn 2 strong reoccurring details about my death. I would not die alone, and I would not die hungry. I had made it my life's ambition to capture this nightmarish scene upon my canvas, for I am an artist of sorts. I never seemed to quite seize the true essence of that last final moment. Something was missing, either from my conscious or unconscious mind, and I charged myself with the duty to discover that missing spark of clarity. This brings me to my true motive for buying the house. It would serve as my muse, my conduit to those bygone days of old Bartontown. Within those rotting beams and creaking, sagging roof, I would live in isolation, channeling the old magic whilst I paint my masterpiece, and once and for all unravel the mystery surrounding what I grew to believe was my impending, preordained death. I decided early on that I would do very little, if any, renovation to the house. I needed it to stand in its perfect decomposing glory, if it was indeed going to enlighten me to the extent required to spark my imagination into painting my crowning achievement. After signing the necessary paperwork, I still had business to attend to in Manchester. So, painfully, I had to leave Barton behind for a week or so to sort out these pressing affairs. I left the solicitor, Mr. Fisher, with a small list of work I wanted to organize concerning the house in my absence, and he was happy enough to do it. The house had no electricity, but I was more than happy with gaslight, so this needed to be looked into. Running water, too, was a necessity, as were new doors and locks. A few of the windows needed replacing too, but I made it clear to him I wanted as much of the original glass preserved as possible, so only those windows that had fallen into irreversible repair were to be replaced. Mr. Fisher advised me that the land around the house was also in need of some attention. The feeble wooden fence surrounding the main house had fallen in many places, and the gardens were so overgrown that you could barely see the difference between them and the woodland beyond. But I insisted on keeping these undisturbed. The meager appointments that kept me away from my beloved house began to wear away at my patience, and the longing to be at the house, and my separation from it, grew to the point of impossible madness. I worked feverishly to settle all my affairs in Manchester, and managed to return to Barton a few days ahead of schedule. I dropped in to see Mr. Fisher, and he assured me that all the work I requested had been done, and with that, I signed the last bit of necessary paperwork, took the keys, and made my way straight to Gunner's Cloth with a reserved, hidden joy. There were 2 main ways to access the house. The first was a feeble back path that branched off from Elmwood Road and eventually degraded into an overgrown woodland byway that nobody used. This path would bring me out at the bottom of a small bank, through which a fern-choked stream cut lazily through the woods. From the bank, some rough stone steps, slick, green, and fungus-ridden, would lead hazardously up to the back garden of my new home. The second method of entry was quicker and by far my more preferred. This path cut through the cemetery of Barton Parish and led to the Gunner's Cloth at the back. This path would lead me through the trees, and after a decent walk through, would bring me to the front of the house, and so it became my preferred journey. The towering wych elms greeted me as I reached the far end of the graveyard and into Gunner's Cloth proper. The autumn sun disappeared quickly as the tangled and gnarled canopy strangled out the rays of light, and in very little time, all was dark and muted. I must re-emphasize the latter because it was unearthly silent in the woodland. No birds or insects agitated me with their incessant twitter or buzzing as I traveled deeper into the trees, and I developed a half fancy in my mind that the creatures of Gunner's Cloth were showing respectable silence, for a new master had arrived, and adoration must be shown. Then, abruptly, and with a rekindled but welcome terror of childhood fantasies, the house came into view. I increased my step, not from fear of the dark trees or the eerie forest quiet, but from pure, distilled excitement. The house stood before me. I dropped my bags in awe, just as I had done when I first saw the titanic terror as a child, and gaped, slack-jawed at the majesty and beauty of the structure that stood before me. The windows had been fixed, but there was enough of the original smoky glass left that the repairs were barely noticeable. Like everything else in the immediate vicinity, these had been engulfed by the aura of dread the house emitted. I cannot say for how long I stood there in hushed ecstasy, but eventually I regained my sense of self and snapped out of the hypnosis, taking my bags to the front door. The large iron key provided by Mr. Fisher slotted into the lock with a fantastic and sinking clunk, and I turned it laboriously, slowly and deliberately, in order to savor the sights and smells of what lay beyond the threshold. There was little sound. I expected a creak from the door, but it swung open smoothly, silently. I walked forward and fully drank in the gloomy scene. There was enough light reaching the windows to permit me to see, but not in great detail. This I greatly enjoyed, as it allowed me to conjure up whatever imagined phantoms I desired. I half danced through the hall and into the lounge, into the kitchen, and the empty rooms beyond, whose original purpose was lost on me. My mind was in a haze of delight as every childhood horror and imagined terror played out before me like a grand play. Fantasized noises and sights spewed forth from the depths of my subconscious, and for a moment, I was in Tartarus itself. There was one detail, however, that was not fantasy, and that was the overpowering musk of decay that assaulted my nostrils and brought me once again back to the physical plane. It was a carnal smell, at once sweet and sickly. It was the scent of death, and it was everywhere. I concluded, erroneously, that an animal must have crawled into the house and died, leaving its rotting carcass concealed somewhere beneath the floorboards or the attic above. I searched at once for the source of the sepulchre fragrance, but to no avail. There was no sign of a dead animal anywhere, not in the bedrooms above or the small cramped attic overseeing the whole rotting affair. The investigation into the cause of the smell was not entirely fruitless, for it revealed to me fully the horrifying glory of the aforementioned attic space. For such a large house, the attic was tiny. The roof was so low that I had to stoop once inside, and to my dismay, it was barren and empty. I had hoped to find some relic from the house's past, but there was only dust and dry cobwebs. The entire structure felt wrong. The beams sloped at queer angles and created all manner of vicissitudes that caused my mind to spin. Areas of the roof bent inward and then sharply outwards with no reason or rhyme. Some needless corners had been created from the beams for no apparent purpose. I felt like I stood trapped within some kind of impossible triacontrahedron, a mental hall of mirrors that reflected all the unknown laws of the universe back upon themselves. I quickly concluded that the original builder had to have either been a genius or a lunatic. I made the decision on the spot right there. Here I would paint my masterpiece. Here I would sit in the shadows, with the feeble light from the singular round window that loomed menacingly above me, and vomit forth my magnum opus. Despite the banquet of horrors my brain had feasted upon since my arrival, I had no desire to start my painting just yet. Instead, I moved all my equipment into the attic, ready for when the black mood would take me. I retired downstairs for the evening. I had yet to buy a bed to sleep in, and the crumbling, rotting frame of what was left in the master bedroom was hardly fitting. I unpacked my cases and arranged the essentials: my painting tools, my coffee, which I immediately set to boil on the kitchen stove, and my cigarettes. I had brought some simple foodstuffs, cheese, bread, and cold cooked meat, which I ate in my usual detached way. I resigned myself to an early night, equipping the dusty sofa with a sleeping bag I had bought in Manchester, and slowly welcomed the coming darkness. I had hoped that my first day in the house would inspire me in my usual nightmarish death scene, from which I would transmute paint to the canvas with untold dread in the morning. The dream, however, did not come. At least, it did not come in the usual fashion I had come to expect. In its place, an all-new terror had shambled onto the mind's midnight stage, its curtains slowly opening as my eyes gradually closed. I found myself lost in a maze of earth-hewn tunnels, slick with niter and damp to the touch. I knew it had to be underground, but how far down, I could not tell. I had only a hand lamp for light, and I made my way along the twisting carnal corridor with no sense of purpose or reason, pressing forward into the waiting gloom. Gibbering sounds could be heard echoing all around me from an unknown direction, half barks and half hushed voices. I strained to make out the words they spoke. I could hear only a few scratching utterances, but what I could hear terrified me to my core. Small, semi-comprehensive sentences such as, "He has come.
Shall we feast? Quiet, he's listening."
I saw shapes dart around just out of my radius of vision. Hideous canine countenances grinned at me with bestial craving. Semi-human eyes rolled loose in their sockets and mocked me from the shadows. I tried to run, but lost my footing, crashing to the floor. I expected to wake, as was typical in a dream when you fall, but I did not. My lamp shattered on the ground, and the light instantly disappeared, gobbled up by the hungry darkness. Then they came for me, dozens upon dozens of eyes, swollen and misshapen. I felt claws embrace me like iron vices, and in the blackness, I felt my body rise from the floor. My scene suddenly shifted. I now found myself in the attic, sat in front of my canvas, straining to see what image lay upon it. A cacophony of crashing noises stampeded below me, growing closer and closer. I panicked, picking up a nearby brush and frantically tried to finish the piece I had started. Then slowly, the hatch to the attic, a small square on the floor by my feet, opened, revealing again those almost human eyes that looked upon me with ghoulish lust. I screamed and then awoke. The cold sweat chilled me as I stirred on the sofa. I looked around and half expected to see one of my fiendish adversaries waiting to pounce. But mercifully, I was alone. The sunlight penetrated the lounge window, and I looked at my waist to see the morning had passed me by. It was 2:15 in the afternoon, and I had grossly overslept. Despite my uncharacteristic dozing, I did not feel refreshed in the least. In fact, I felt quite the opposite, and could have slept for much longer had I been an undisciplined man. I made breakfast and went into the back garden, where I lit a cigarette and strolled around in the brisk air, taking in the sights of the woodland beyond. Unlike my initial arrival, there was now activity among the creatures of Gunner's Cloth, and all manner of beasts were happily singing, chirping, and croaking away. The noise was so loud, in fact, that I finished my cigarette quickly and went back into the house, pulling my collar up against the cold. I still felt no compulsion to paint, and did not visit the attic at all that day. In fact, I actively avoided entering the place. My muscles were sore, a product of my poor sleeping conditions, and I wandered around the house from room to room like a lost soul searching for purpose. As I made a second trip around the ground floor rooms, I also noticed that the rotten smell I first encountered from the day before was gone. I cannot say I was not pleased about this. Perhaps a scavenger had visited during the night and taken the foul source away to its den to feast upon in safety. With the day drawing on, and nothing to do but drink coffee and smoke, I decided instead to pack some sandwiches and spend what was left of the day in Barton Village. Barton had a small, humble library, and what it lacked in academic literature, it made up for in local history and folklore. My area of search was, quite naturally, the house. With help from the hoary librarian, who had served at the library for as long as I could remember, I was able to track down some scant information concerning the house in the woods and the family who had once laid claim to it. From a small book entitled A Treaty of Demonic Influences in Cheshire, penned by an Eastwich author called Samuel Gaunt, I was able to find an obscure reference to a man called Jonathan Bickham, who had once lived in the house, which was known simply as the House in Elmwood. Bickman, according to the librarian, was forced to flee Barton altogether some 220 years past when it became known that he was in possession of a small library of forbidden books that had, at the time, been banned by the church. The worst of these offenders had been titled Les Cultes des Ghouls, a tome not wholly unfamiliar to me. I had heard of this particular book whilst at university, and it was always mentioned in hushed whispers by unsavory types. I found the name Bickham to be of special interest, for my own surname of Pickman was somewhat similar, having a common origin in the old Saxon tribe of Beacombe. Of the aforementioned ghoulish tome, I could find no further information other than the author being a Frenchman called the Comte d'Erlet. But I had a name of Bickman to go on, and I instead focused upon that line of investigation. With the few hours of sunlight remained, I traced all reference to the Bickham family and their lineage. The family had both built and owned the house I now lived in for many generations, but had forsaken it several decades before I was born. These then must be the blighted bloodline that had laid claim to my beloved house and abandoned it, or instead faded into oblivion, leaving it behind. Of the fate of the Bickman line, nothing could be found. It was suggested that the last scion of the family died with no heir, but there were also references to a family of the same name leaving for New England many years ago. It seemed unlikely that I could ever piece together the ultimate fate of the family, but they didn't overly concern me. The house was mine now, and would remain so forever. My sandwiches remained uneaten, and I discarded them into a nearby hedge on my walk back through the crooked alleyways and cramped bungalows of Barton. The dying sun painted the village with maddening shadows of orange and pinks, all the while casting long, mutated shadows that transformed even the most innocuous of objects into nameless terrors. As I opened the gate to my cadaverous shortcut, I realized the unique opportunity presented to me to further my research, and took it with celeritious conviction. Row upon row of weathered headstones offered me a different sort of library, and I searched gleefully for the name of Bickham among the weathered gravestones. Confusingly, my search ended in disappointment, for not a single stone bore the name I feverishly sought. That not a single Bickham graced those lifeless cribs diffused me greatly, and I retired back to my house, defeated and sour. As I made my way along the darkening woodland path, I once again noticed the lack of animal sounds. This was no surprise, as I assumed most of the creatures who had participated in the morning's cacophony were diurnal and had likely retired. But still, the silence was oppressive, and followed me all the way back to my home. I lit the gas lamps in the lounge, and drank in the somber surroundings I would once again be calling my bedroom for the night. The sun had now completely vanished from the sky, allowing the stars and moon to take the stage and perform their indifferent watch over the darkened earth. It had been my intention to pen a letter to a learned friend in Manchester concerning Les Cultes des Ghouls, but as I took pen to paper, a wave of apathy took hold of me, and I suddenly found myself drowsy and languid. Once more, I found myself in the tunnels. This time the light was even dimmer as I gripped a half-dying candle and not a lamp. The impression of being even further beneath the earth gripped me, and I wandered aimlessly in random directions, occasionally tripping over stray rocks and other debris whose hollow clicking and clattering sent a chill racing up my spine. The tunnel grew wider as I traveled and opened up before me in a large, almost square chamber, lined with row upon row of long wooden coffins. The darkness hampered my investigation, but I could make out dozens of horrid cradles, some open and scattered, others arranged haphazardly atop one another. For the first time in my history of nightmarish hallucinations, the reality of what I was seeing started to become apparent. This did not feel like a dream. As this realization overtook me, a voice whispered from behind and into my ear, its words mumbled and mercifully incomprehensible. As I felt that fetid breath upon the back of my neck, I was taken by the sensation of a sudden rising and found myself flung once more into the lonesome confines of the attic above. Again, I squatted in front of the canvas, straining to see what was painted upon it. The work appeared more complete than in my previous dream, and I noticed I was holding a brush in my right hand, while something cold and gelatinous lay clutched in the other. The face at the attic door gibbered once again, and as I looked down, I saw not one, but several sets of eyes through the thin gap. Several sets of huge, swollen spheres of mad jelly lay focused upon me, rolling around, unblinking in their dead, fleshy sockets. I did my best to ignore them and continue to paint. I strained greatly to actually see what I was painting, but the image was blurry and shifted unreasonably before my eyes. In one brief moment of clarity, I have fancied that I saw my own face looking back at me from the stained canvas. As this realization swept over me, I started to panic. The smashing sounds below erupted once more, and the attic door swung open violently. My heart leapt in my throat, and I raised my arms defensively to try to beat away the swarms of clawed hands that grasped at me. I screamed into the void as a deeper darkness engulfed the attic and swallowed me whole. Morning came, and relieved, I awoke from the sofa, my heart racing. The usual ritual of coffee and breakfast followed, but I felt more like a spectator watching these mundane events from a distance, as opposed to being actively involved in them. Once more, I failed to muster the energy to paint, but only this time I felt a shred of genuine fear when the thought of sitting in the attic with my canvas entered my mind. I scolded myself internally. Had this not been what I wanted? To feel terror and use it as a muse to help me create? But try as I might, I could not start painting, and avoided the upper rooms of my house. Instead, I looked upon the makeshift writing desk where I had begun my letter the night before, and decided to finish what I had started. In addition to asking my friend about Les Côtes des Goules, I also asked if he could make use of the superb facilities of the Manchester Library, and found out all of the information concerning the Bickham family of Cheshire. I would have left for Manchester myself, but I was loath to leave my house, lest I lose the aura of horror it has projected upon me. For no matter how much the fear would grip me, in the end, I was certain in my convictions that I could transform it into creativity. In the meantime, I would impose upon a nearby source of information that quite literally stood on my doorstep. Leaving my house, I walked toward the parish church in search of its priest, in hopes that he may know why no Bickham rested in his cemetery. As luck would have it, I stumbled upon him as I exited the woodland. He stood with his back turned to me, slightly hunched over a headstone on the outskirts of the graveyard, and as I approached, I could see that it was curiously entangled with a matted net of lush green ivy that had snaked its way around a peculiar worn and weather-beaten headstone. I made no attempt to mask my presence, as I didn't wish to startle him, for he seemed oblivious and lost in his work. He had in his hand a notepad, and on the floor nearby lay several old and large tomes, similar in character to those I had read at the Barton Library. I had to cough in that repugnant and obvious manner in order to gain his attention, which it did. I introduced myself quickly, and he likewise. Reverend Stephen Spencer was his name, and he did not seem keen to speak to me at all. I got straight to the point quickly and asked why, despite being a resident family for generations, there were no Bickham family buried on the grounds. In a detached and wholly disinterested manner, he replied quickly and simply. The Bickham family, he explained, had special permission from the council to inter their dead upon their property. There was, he guessed, a family tomb or crypt of some sorts in the gunner's cloth where the deceased Bickmans now lay. He did, however, warn that several years ago, an incident of flooding had caused large sections of the woodland bank to collapse and erode, revealing long-buried caskets that may or may not have belonged to the family. With that, he went straight back to his ivy-shrouded headstone, and even when I thanked him for the information, he dismissed it with a wave of his hand in a clearly agitated manner. I recognized a kindred soul within that gray flesh of Reverend Spencer, and did not wish to disturb him further. I had instead a much more exciting engagement to keep, and after dropping off my letter to my Manchester colleague at the local post office, I started my lurid treasure hunt in the Gunner's Cloth woodland. I had little idea of where to start my search for the hidden mausoleum, but due to the Reverend's story of exhumed graves, I assumed it would be somewhere near the sloping forest banks to the back of the property. As I had said earlier, the distinction between garden and forest was at best difficult to discern, and I stumbled through bramble and nettle alike, suffering the tiny barbs of those needleless weeds as I pressed further and further. The trees and ferns grew denser and thicker as I ambled carelessly through the foliage, and after what seemed like an eternity of struggling and scraping, my eyes finally set sight upon that which I had sought, standing proudly and defiantly within a clearing that was no less than a perfect circle of withered wych elms. The final resting place of the deceased Bickmans lay before me. I walked within that ring of sinister, ligneous guardians and watched as a cascade of brown leaves danced around the clearing, carried upon a chill breeze that manifested as I drew ever closer to my prize. The stone was gray in areas, but mostly covered in fine green moss that looked like a coat of sickly fur. The Roman-like pillars that crowned the rusted metal entrance had cracked and crumbled beyond repair, but betrayed an obvious 18th century Romantic period construction. Two large vases sat squat in front of the pillars, and both had accumulated a body of brown, foul-smelling water, above which scores of insect intruders buzzed. The appearance of flies was uncommon for this time of year, but given their appetites, they could flourish into autumn and beyond, providing the right banquet. Corpse-consuming invertebrates, however, were not the reason I had come, and I walked past the stagnant chalices and up the steps to the tomb entrance. No lock or chain barred my entrance to this house of the dead, and I swung open the door with little resistance, so much so that it almost left its hinges entirely, for it was brittle and decayed with centuries of rust. What lay inside the dark was of little surprise. Shelves had been carved into the walls for the express purpose of housing mortal remains, of which only a few rotted coffins remained. Unable to resist the urge to look upon those who had possessed what is now mine, I removed the lid on what was the most intact casket to gaze at what lay within. To my surprise, no grinning skull or osseous fragments lay within. Rather, there was something that was at once so mundane and harmless, and yet also so horrifyingly suggestible. For within the coffin, there simply lay a mass of rocks and bricks, far too many to have been placed there by mistake, and there was no way that they had come there by accident. I quickly inspected the other coffins, and they too held within their depths only the same cold collection of stone. I leaned against the inner wall of the mausoleum and rattled my brains for an explanation, and just as one was forming in that dark corner of my mind from whence the fantastical is drawn, I noticed something on the floor that I had previously missed during my investigation. A door. It was a stone hatch shot through with a thick rusted ring that lay at the back of the tomb, fitting into the floor. Rocks and debris lay upon it, along with piles of dust, but even though there was precious little light in the building, I could see the unmistakable outline of this hidden entrance. I hurried over and dropped to my knees, swatting the sediment of ages away until the trapdoor was free of obstacles. I tried the ring and found it stubborn and difficult to dislodge, but bracing myself with both legs bent and both hands wrapped around the iron ring, I pulled with all the strength my feeble frame could muster, and in one moment of total victory, the trapdoor relinquished and gave up its secret. What greeted me once the lid was removed was a thin cast iron ladder bolted to the side of the cavity and leading directly downwards into the dark below. I cursed inwardly for not having a source of light with me, and then remembered my matches in my trouser pocket. Striking one against the stone floor, I looked at it reluctantly. Clearly it would not provide much, and had I been in a more reasonable frame of mind, I would have made my way back to the house to fetch a lantern. I had come so far, however, I longed to press forward further. I descended the ladder, and thankfully found it quite sturdy despite its obvious age. It was more or less still attached to the wall, even though it rattled with hollow metallic sound as I descended. The journey downwards lasted much longer than I anticipated, and on occasion I could feel the ladder sway gently as I forced my weight downwards. Thankfully, it held through the entire descent, and when I finally reached the bottom, the entrance at the top looked further away than I was comfortable with. My match had of course extinguished, so I lit another and walked forward. I was in a tunnel. It was damp and musty, and even though it was obviously man-made, there was a slick, natural look to the walls. There were no sconces or candles or lanterns lining those brown walls, a fact I cursed as the match quickly burnt out, forcing me to light another. I had traveled some 20 yards when the tunnel turned into a crossroads, intersecting with another passage, which gave me 3 new possible routes with which to continue my insane sojourn. I decided to head straight forward, less chance of getting lost that way, and just as I was about to press forward, I stood upon something that crunched underfoot. A little startled, my match dropped to the ground, and I knelt down to light another so that I could see what I had disturbed on the ground. As the pale orange glow flared up and then shrunk into the semi-useful flame that had guided me so far, I could see the light reflect off what appeared to be broken glass. I looked around and instantly recognized what was cast upon the floor of that nightmarish burrow. It was my lamp, the one I had dropped and shattered during that insane dream I experienced several nights past. Panicking, I knelt down and picked up the shards, frantically examining them in hopes that I was wrong. I fitted between rationality and insanity. How could this be? As I pondered the madness of my situation, I suddenly became aware of a presence behind me. I froze, unable to move. I knew I was awake, but I closed my eyes in hopes that I was wrong. As the shuffling noise behind me edged closer, I squinted my eyes as hard as I could, begging whichever god was listening to allow me to leave this nightmare. A cold hand gently laid itself upon my right shoulder, followed by another on my left. The chill caused my flesh to crawl and shrink away, and without a moment's hesitation, I ran into the darkness. Somewhere ahead, I stumbled and was sent crashing to the ground. The darkness slowly coalesced around me as a welcoming unconsciousness washed over my mind. It was dark when I awoke upon the sofa. I must have passed out and hit my head upon the tunnel floor, for several small cuts now graced my brow. I looked into my pocket mirror and confirmed this as I could see the congealed blood where the stones had struck. My feet were soggy with mud, and I had no recognition of how I made it back to the house. If it weren't for the blood and the dirt, I wouldn't have been able to separate dream from reality and would have remained ignorant to the horror that had gripped me. I braced myself and stood up, making my way into the kitchen and hoping a cup of coffee could clear the fog from my brain. I touched my wounded brow once again and winced sharply as I did so. That's when the smell hit me. It was similar to the scent that had first greeted me days ago when I entered the house. A carrion stench, carnal and nauseous. It invaded my senses with disgusting impunity. I walked again around the house, going from room to room, searching for the source of the new cadaverous stench. Growing frustrated, I let out a long sigh and, with ultimate horror, discovered that it was my own mouth that was the root of the offending aroma. I reached inside, and with a rising, revolting realization, I ran my tongue over my teeth, feeling chunks of something trapped between them. I had not eaten for hours and wondered how this could be. I ran back over to the sofa and picked up my pocket mirror, realizing as I did so just how dark the room had grown. I angled the mirror as best I could against the light of a freshly lit candle to better see what foreign object was lodged in my mouth. I could see brown, stringy matter hanging loosely from my front teeth. I pulled it forward with my forefinger and thumb, and with a quick, wet tug, it came away. It smelled repulsive beyond belief and resembled decaying poultry of some variety. I felt vomit rise in my throat and ran to the front door in need of fresh air, which greeted me with a gust as I swung the door open and emptied the contents of my stomach on the front step. Instantly, I felt better, though I could not bring myself to look upon that which had just exited my innards and collapsed in the doorway. It was dark outside. It must have been either early in the morning or late at night, but I could not tell either way. My hand brushed something in the doorway, and I instinctively picked it up to inspect. It was a letter. I murmured, confused to myself, for it was unusual for me to receive any post with so few friends or family knowing my address. It must have been from Mr. Fisher, I concluded as I opened the envelope and read the contents. It was, however, from my friend in Manchester, a reply to the letter I believed to have sent him that very day. Disbelief engulfing me, I looked at the date. It was several days after I had sent the original correspondence. Had I been sleeping that long? What had happened to me underneath that dreadful mausoleum? I pulled sleep from my eyes and read the letter, its contents taking several readings to sink in fully.
Martin, not only do I never hear from you unless you want something from me, but now you want me to research your own lineage for you. Oh well, I guess you are either too focused on your paintings or too lazy to get this information for yourself. But ever your servant, I have done as you asked. Concerning Les Côtes des Goules, yes, I have heard of it, as I am sure many of our associates have. It is, to be frank, a book concerning the workings of black magic, written by François-Henri Belfort, the Comte d'Erlet, sometime in the early 18th century. It concerns itself mainly with an underground cult who are said to worship the ghouls, who themselves revere much older and darker gods. Belfort is said to have made contact with this cult, and through them learned of the horrid metamorphosis mankind can undergo to join the ghouls, who are immortal and live in endless death. Pure fantasy, really. It was denounced by the church not long after its printing. Belfort himself vanished, but I suspect he fled to England or Italy and took another name. I find it amusing you should ask of the Bickham name, you being a descendant of the line yourself. They are indeed from Cheshire, but some of them later moved to Massachusetts, I believe, following accusations of witchcraft. Those in America changed their name and instead became known as Pickmen, of which you are descendant when they later returned to Britain and once again took up their original surname. The last person to bear the Bickham-Pickman blood in Cheshire was one Nathan Bickham, who resided in the house you now own, but that you already knew, surely. Or do you mean to tell me that your obsession with the house has developed independently of your knowledge of this lineage? Fascinating. You clearly are a sensitive soul. I look forward to your next painting. Incidentally, Haywood has been showing off that painting you sold him to every twit in Manchester, who fancies himself a Poe or Goya. He has offered for it, you know. Twice and thrice as much as he paid for it. The cretin. It may very well swell your ego to know that he hangs it next to the crowning masterpiece of his collection, The Lesson, that hideous and perverted monstrosity of unknown origin. Oh well, I hope your work is going well. I really must come and visit you, time permitting. Yours, E.D.
I crumpled up the letter and cast it aside, knowing now the full horror of what was in store for me. Smudges of paint on my hands confirmed what I had suspected. My painting was finished, created during the grip of that perverse somnambulance that had cursed me since I entered the house, aided by the nighttime lords of Elmwood House. They who had once wore the faces of the mortal Bickham bloodline. Now I sit in horrid semi-darkness, the flickering of dying candles my only source of light and warmth. I stare across the attic upon the finished canvas and at the figures painted upon it. They almost come to life as my eyes adjust to the blackness. I can see hordes of white-fleshed, naked corpses clamoring and colliding into a pile of madness and cadaverous peaks, upon which I have painted myself sat atop. A slab of meat has been painted, clutched in my hands, and a look of unbridled lust portrayed on my face. I can hear the horde below me, crashing and breaking through the house. They are coming for me, coming to welcome one of their own into the pack. This is how I will die. This is how I always knew I would die. Even though I now understand the horrid truth, one detail still eludes me. They are here to force upon me that last and final act that will secure my place in their immortal ranks for all time, until the stars die and the old ones are free once more to roam the dark corners of man's domain. What I do not know, however, is this. When the end comes and I look upon that lifeless flesh in my hands, will I lick my lips with glee as the painting shows I will? Or will my weak and feeble body instead provide the feast for those hideous tenants who even now slowly open the door to the attic and who, since time immemorial, have laid beneath the Elmwood House, the house in the woods, the house of the dead gods? Hey everybody. This story was more like a Lovecraftian story, especially at the end when it talks about like the old gods. I think it'd be pretty interesting to do some more Lovecraftian horror. I did have that book a while ago. It was like, I can't remember what it's called, but it was just a whole bunch of stories by H.P. Lovecraft. And I tried doing it a while ago, but it's like written in Old English, and so it was really difficult to narrate. But I think it'd be fun to try it again. If I was to do that, is there any specific Lovecraftian style story that any of you know of that you'd like me to do? But as for this story, I like the way the story played out. I think that it did a good job of laying things out slowly throughout the story, but then tying it all together at the end. I'm curious to see what you all think of it. As for the stories I have coming up, I'm working on a few more 30-minute to hour-long stories for you, and I'm almost done with The Portal in the Forest, and I'm just going to upload that as one video. It's going to be about 2 or 3 hours long. But yeah, I look forward to chatting with you all in the comments, and I hope you have a great day. Uncle Marsh had always been the black sheep of our family, a thorn in my father's side, and a constant reminder of how corrupt and decayed our ancestral roots truly were. Sebastian Frederick Marsh was my mother's elder brother, a genetic throwback, a deviant, and, if the rumors surrounding him were true, a man acquainted with the most hellish of sins. His appearance was enough to make the most stoic of hearts skip a beat before its shambling gait. Flat-headed, thick-lipped, and possessing the largest, glassiest bulging eyes found in the sockets of any earthbound creature. His appearance was nothing less than outlandish. He would stumble along the cobbled streets of Barton Village every Saturday morning in his weekly sojourn to the local stores. The journey caused his neighbors great unease, and passerby would cross the street in an effort to avoid exchanging even the simplest of pleasantries with the man. I was particularly disturbed by my uncle's visage, as I, unfortunately, shared a few of his more loathsome traits myself. Thankfully, however, these were less pronounced and shocking than those found on my uncle's grim face. My mother, too, shared what was known in Barton as the Marsh look, although her deviant features, like mine, were softer and even less obvious than my own. She got away lightly indeed, with large watery eyes, her only obvious heritage of the tainted Marsh bloodline. Uncle Marsh lived alone, tucked away in a rotting abode that lurked and leaned queerly at odd angles at the back of Gunner's Cloth, a feral grotto that skirted the cemetery at the south end of the village. It was a lonesome stretch of sepulchre woodland, home only to the witch elms, the creeping moss, and my gloomy uncle. Many an odd tale was attached to the Gunner's Cloth. Strange lights and raised voices were often heard from the depths of the woods on those days leading up to the nights of Hallows Eve and Walpurgis. It was not unknown for local pets, and occasionally even children, to go missing and turn up dead on the mornings after those nights, when the frogs croaked loudly and the owls hooted their omens of warning. I remember when I was very young, my mother issued me a warning to never enter the Gunner's Cloth, despite my uncle living there, and I often wondered just what witchcraft was being played out in secret beneath the skeletal trees. These warnings were ubiquitous among all Barton children, and with good reason. Before I was born, a local child had been found dead in the woods, half submerged in the black slop that had once been a stream passing through the cloth. Little was done about the matter. It was assumed that the child had fallen into the muck and drowned, but every Barton resident was quick to attribute a more sinister conclusion to the life of little Maggie Hagen. Despite the macabre reputation, or perhaps because of it, the whole area was the haunting ground of young boys during the summer months, and sadly, with the great embarrassment, my uncle was seen as something of a local boogeyman by my peers. As a result, he suffered relentless taunting at the hands of Barton's children. There was precious little else to do in the village during the school summer break, and the taunting of my uncle became something of a local sport. Boys would prove their mettle by hurling rocks at the windows of the Gunner's Cloth cottage where my uncle resided, or knocking on his door only to flee as the frog-faced resident cautiously answered their call before slinking back into the dark of his home. Being the nephew of Mad Marsh meant that by proxy, I too suffered from the attentions of my uncle's tormentors, and I tried desperately to make myself invisible in and out of school. I succeeded in this endeavor to such a level that I had successfully alienated myself from everyone outside of my family in just a few short years. One year, on Halloween, the onslaught of abuse directed towards my uncle reached such feverish heights that it culminated in a planned mass egging of his home. Only one boy in town possessed enough bravado to see this task to conclusion, however: Jamie Birtle. It was Jamie alone who entered the gunner's cloth on that dreadful night, chest puffed out and a box of rotten eggs held confidently in his hands. When the boy finally returned, many hours later, to the circle of children crowning the edge of that necromantic woodland, waiting in anticipation for their champion, he was forever and irreversibly changed, transmuted, transformed, and left naught but a shell of what was once a lively child. He staggered out of the woodlands a dumb and silent specter. Poor Jamie Birtle, the terror of all children younger than himself, said nothing about what he had seen in the dark that night, nor would he ever speak a single syllable again his whole miserable life. Eventually, the glassy-eyed mute was taken away from his parents and moved to the Byron House, a home for the mentally disadvantaged. There he stayed for many years, banging his head against the wall of his cell to a silent, alien rhythm, until fate gave him the opportunity to escape his confines and leap to his death. Exactly 13 years since he first lurched out of the shadows of the wych elm trees. My uncle was questioned about the incident, of course, but denied ever seeing the boy, let alone speaking to him or causing him harm. This event left me even more isolated than the other children. Before that night, they might have included me in their torments, but once Jamie had been forever silenced, they avoided me completely. I very rarely saw Uncle Marsh in person. Occasionally, he would show up at a family get-together or function to make a token effort to remind us that he still existed in this world, only to disappear just as abruptly as he had arrived. My father in particular despised the man. He hated the appearance of his brother-in-law, and he hated that his wife and son were kin to the man. But most of all, he hated the way Marsh collected queer objects in strange moldy tomes. Marsh was something of a scholar, at least of a certain sort, and loved to devour information from his astounding collection of books. His library consisted of a mass of sprawling grimoires and papers scattered around his living room in no discernible order, a chaotic crumbling mess of ancient and esoteric knowledge. Many of those decaying, musty volumes were written in languages unspoken in the isolated villages and hamlets of northwest England. Archaic German, French, Latin, Greek, and scripts so wholly alien in structure that they must have been impossibly extraterrestrial in origin. Other, far stranger items dotted the cramped corners of the cottage that Marsh called home. Warped, bent skulls, exotic stuffed birds, crystals shaped in geometric arrangements that were maddeningly complex. This was the legacy of my Uncle Marsh, a repulsive, isolated, semi-antiquarian, semi-human recluse, obsessed with the forbidden and in love with the wicked and strange. These memories and thoughts flashed vividly in my mind as I sat opposite the stern, cold face of Mr. Fisher, my family's long-suffering solicitor. Just seconds ago, he had impassionately read aloud the contents of my uncle's late will and testament, in which a man I barely knew and had good reason to despise had left me all of his earthly and unearthly possessions. Uncle Marsh's death had been as singular and strange as his life. In the early morning of July 24th, 1954, he had stood naked on the sands of Seascale Beach in Copeland, Cumbria, and walked slowly and deliberately into the waiting maw of the churning Irish Sea. A trail of large, flat footprints in the sand and a pile of scattered clothing were all that had remained of the man. Although a body was never found, he was declared legally dead some years after, and had left instructions with Mr. Fisher that I, his only nephew, was to receive all he had ever owned. The significance of the location of his demise was not lost upon me. For decades ago, my family had lived in the town of Seascale. The sea had always been in my family's blood, and many a Marsh had took to the waves as fishermen, sailors, or even pirates. At least if one was to believe the various myths and legends surrounding us, for the marsh blood was tainted, or so the stories said. The original branch of the family had come to England from the United States, where a great deal of my relatives had lived in the decaying and damned port town of Innsmouth, Massachusetts. Innsmouth itself was a nest of horrid myths and repulsive witch lore. We had come to Cumbria under a cloak of dark suspicion and dread, chased out by the locals as warlocks and werewolves, forced across the bitter Atlantic, and finally ejected upon the shores of Old Blighty. Whatever it was that had segregated us from the other branches of the family, for many a marsh still resided in rotting Innsmouth, none can say. My grandparents certainly would not discuss the matter. My own family had to move away from Copeland and into the small village of Barton, Cheshire, due to a chance meeting between my mother and father during a blistering hot summer holiday, which my father had chosen to spend by the seaside. My father had been a keen lover of architecture, from ancient Roman ruins to Georgian estates. He had traveled the length and breadth of Britain in search of historic adventures. It was during such a trip that he learned of Seascale and its magnificent Victorian hotel, the Scafell. During his stay in the town, he had encountered my mother on the beach as she collected various seashells, live crabs, and bits of driftwood. Enraptured by her large green eyes and raven black hair, my father spent much of the summer with the strange girl who was to become my mother, and they quickly became close friends and confidants. Some months later, the two young lovers were engaged and made the move to my father's home village, marrying at the parish church before buying a home in one of the cramped and sloping alleys of shadow-haunted Barton. Eventually, there had been an unwelcome catch to this otherwise auspicious joining. Sebastian, my mother's elder brother, would also be making the move to Barton with them. My grandparents, you see, were sadly in no fit state to look after the man, who was himself somewhat mentally disadvantaged, or backwards, as my father would say, and wholly ignorant of many social norms we often take for granted in this day and age. The elder Marshes were hopelessly advanced in age too, and it was clear that they feared for their son's well-being, when the inevitable shedding of their mortal coil took them to the cold and unwelcoming grave. So, with great reluctance, but also out of love for his wife, my father agreed to take Sebastian with them to Barton, where he lived with them for several months before finally acquiring the decomposing cottage in the woods behind the cemetery. Not long after my parents' marriage, my Marsh grandparents succumbed to a kind of wasting disease. I had never actually seen either of them, nor had my father encountered them more than a handful of times, as they did not have the strength to attend their daughter's wedding. Sebastian and my mother both attended the funeral in Seascale, in which a few gray, shadowy strangers appeared, many of them also being the odd martial look. It was during this time my uncle acquired the vast bulk of his blighted library and bizarre trinkets from my grandparents' home, nestled as they were in the boarded-up attic bedroom in which they had strangely spent the majority of their later years in total seclusion. The years passed by in Barton, and while my parents made a home for themselves and started a family, my uncle continued to live alone in the woods, his collection of fungal books and stuffed animals his only companion. As I have already mentioned, I was by no means close to my uncle, and although I did not hate him with the burning vitriol my father had reserved for the man, he had still unnerved and nauseated me on the few occasions I was unlucky enough to be in the same room as him, and I was genuinely taken aback by being made his sole heir. All this no doubt accounted for the puzzled look that must have graced my face, and to which roused Mr. Fisher to once again break me away from my daydreaming with a sort of deliberate cough. Snapping out of my thoughts, I focused on the solicitor and smiled a weak, apologetic expression, and he proceeded to inform me that the cottage was in a cankerous state of decline and would be unsafe and unfit for habitation, and advised me strongly from entering it, instead suggesting I hire a few locals to fetch me whatever items I desire and deposit them at my own home. He assured me that any effort made to restore the cottage would be nothing but a cash sink and a complete waste of time. It was decayed even by the standards of the other groaning properties that dotted the woods, and truth be told, I had no desire to enter it. He gave me a few more details about various bits and pieces my uncle had left me. A few pounds squirreled away in a bank account, and also the residence that my grandparents had lived in back in Seascale. which I simply asked him to put up for sale on my behalf and to be sold as cheaply as possible. As luck would have it, he managed to sell it quickly to a distant relative, a marsh cousin who still resided in the seaside town and wished for whatever reason to acquire the property. After leaving Mr. Fisher to his paperwork, I left his office and headed straight to my parents' home to talk about the matter with them both in full. My father seemed quite dismissive of the whole affair, assuming, wrongly, that I would have no interest in anything that had belonged to his deceased nemesis. My mother, on the other hand, seemed greatly unnerved by the matter, at first probing me to see what my intentions were regarding my uncle's belongings. Upon hearing that I would be taking them all to my home and cataloging them at my leisure, she could hardly contain her anxiety. This confused me greatly. I assured her that I simply wished to see if there was anything of worth to be sold to collectors, and this seemed to calm her briefly. Finding some local strong-arms to move the immense hoard of junk from my uncle's cottage and to my home proved to be quite difficult at first. Most men of labor in Barton proved to be stupefying in their reluctance to enter Gunner's Cloth and superstitious regarding the marsh name. In the end, I was able to hire a few Polish laborers who, despite being superstitious themselves, were strangers to Barton and ignorant of the mark upon my family's name. I busied myself with work during the week or so it took to ransack my uncle's cottage, and at first barely noticed the hoard of books, stuffed animals, skulls, crystals, and various other bric-a-brac that I had the workers stack as neatly as possible in my cellar. By the time they had finished, the once vacant space beneath my house had become a labyrinth worthy of Crete, a Tartarus of crinkled yellow papers and moaning, sagging shelves. Fortunately, I had fitted the old cellar with electricity when I moved in, but the feeble light provided by that one naked bulb hanging in the center of the room seemed to cast more shadow than light, and gave the various glass-eyed dead animals a haunting quality that kept me away from the collection until I could find someone to take the whole ungodly collection off my hands. The whole collection stayed well out of my mind and life for some weeks to come, as work kept me busy and I put off my once planned mass cataloging in favor of working towards a promotion at work, where I worked as a minor clerk. However, when said promotion passed me by, I took a few weeks' leave from my job and decided to see how much money I could make from selling my uncle's grim treasure trove. Working through the collection proved to be a lesson in patience, and it took what seemed like a lifetime to separate my uncle's notes and diaries from actual printed books and handwritten manuscripts. When I finally did so, I had before me a collection of wicked and unwholesome tomes, musty, fat, and swollen with hundreds of pages of information. Some of the books dated back centuries. The volumes before me threw me into a state of excitement at the possibility of how much cash could be coughed up by a willing collector. I wrote down the names of as many books as I could. There was Contes des Ghouls by Comte de Ariette, Der Vermis Mysteries, penned by necromancer Ludwig Prynne. There was also an English translation of a book called Things of the Water, with its original title, Cathat Aquadingen, presented on the inner pages in a sprawling, spidery penmanship that I suspected to be my uncle's creation. The latter was filled with pages of notes written by my uncle, and various rites and rituals underlined in pencil appeared sporadically throughout the interior. I tried my best to skim this book, being one of the few written in English, but its contents were so haphazardly laid out and unorganized that I simply could not digest any significant information. From within, instead relying upon various words underlined by my uncle. These included Father Dagon, Mother Hydra, Cthulhu, Yonth-Le, Ubo-Sathla, Azathoth, and others, stranger arrangements of letters. Admittedly, I was totally ignorant of the contents of all the books presented before me and dismissed them as either works of fiction or loose fantastical treatises of witchcraft and the occult. Neither of these topics interested me in the slightest, so I decided to write down all I could think of as interesting to collectors, such as titles, authors, dates, and the strange names of pseudo-gods and prehistoric people, and put them in a letter that I sent off to several rare booksellers in London. It did not take long for a reply to reach me. One Dr. Artemis Harlan Glass, a collector and bibliophile, had been put in touch with me via one of his contacts and wrote me a fevered response. His excitement barely contained within his beautifully worded letter. He offered to buy the entire collection from me for a king's ransom. It was a six-figure sum so high that I had to sit down immediately upon reading it in order to finish his letter in full, and had to reread it several times to let its contents sink in fully. Dr. Glass had also made it clear that he wanted any and all personal notes made by the book's previous owners in full, which I understood given the gibberish contents contained within the tomes. However, I decided that I would not hand over my uncle's diaries, for whatever absurd sentimental reasons I may have attached to them. In my reply to the doctor, I simply stated that the collection had come as is, and that no notes had been found among them. I did, however, smooth this over by stating that several of the books had passages underlined, with a few scribbles here and there denoting their manuals and page numbers, where the other notes and information could be found. It wasn't quite the spiderweb of information the doctor had sought, but it appeared to please him nonetheless, and he organized to come and collect the books in person at a prearranged date, just a few days after his reply to my offer. I informed my parents over some afternoon tea of what the doctor had offered me for the books, and to my humor, my father nearly spat out a mouthful of Earl Grey upon hearing that his son was to become so fabulously wealthy. He seemed overjoyed at the news, not for any dreams of personal gain. He had always been the non-materialistic type, but at the prospect of a life such money could provide for me. I knew that he was also secretly happy that being related to Sebastian Marsh had actually paid off in the end, and the money was at once a source of sweet revenge for him and an ointment to smooth over the wounds left by various clashes. My mother's reaction was somewhat similar to my father's, but I could not help but think that it was all a put-on, an act, and that she truly did not want to see my uncle's library in the hands of a stranger. If she had but voiced her concerns, I may have changed my mind, or at least sold perhaps only half of the collection left to me. I informed her that I intended to keep my uncle's diaries and personal notes, but she simply shrugged while nursing a lukewarm cup of tea. My father made a comment about how they would be used to kindle a fire, and we quickly moved on to the topic of what I was going to be doing with the money that would soon be coming my way. I'll admit, when the day came for the doctor to collect the books, a cloud of regret had fallen over me. Despite the ludicrous amount of money that he was offering, I felt somewhat reluctant to part with my uncle's collection. These feelings, no doubt, however, were quickly dispelled as a series of brisk rapping penetrated the quiet of my usual afternoon routine, and I opened my front door to welcome my visitor. Mr. Glass had appeared wholly shocking and disturbing to me. Despite my familiarity with the grotesque and misshapen, he was both painfully thin and shockingly tall. Despite being bent over at the shoulder, he still towered over me by a clear foot. He had the complexion of a fresh corpse, blood drained and transparent, while his head was crowned with a thick head of bushy hair, raven black despite his obvious advanced age. His clothes, too, were as distinct as the man himself, for he clearly dressed in a manner of a gentleman many decades removed from the current age we occupied. These fine clothes were, however, somewhat lost on the man, as his hollow-like frame caused them to hang off him like folds of dark, dead skin. This scarecrow of a man stood at my threshold, nodded, and extended a withered, crinkled hand which I met, almost in a trace with my own. I tried my best not to be repulsed by the doctor's winter-cold skin and long nails as our hands clasped, but I fear that a modicum of my discomfort must have been made apparent to the man, as a cruel smirk broke across his features as I stepped aside to let him in. I watched as the vampiric form of the doctor entered my home, and another wave of anxiety washed over me, for the man who I had just invited into my house was so far removed from what I imagined a cultivated millionaire scholar to look like that I fancied a cruel hoax being played upon me. I had already prepared the collection, and they stood on a table in my living room, wrapped in brown paper and string. Upon seeing the pile, the doctor turned to me with his pale gray eyes and spoke to me in a voice so frail and hollow that I had to strain to hear the shriveled syllables that emitted faintly from his thin lips.
Would you mind, sir, if I took the liberty of confirming the contents of those packages?
I nodded automatically, as if hypnotized by the man's voice, and watched in fright as he glided over to the table and used his long, gnarled talons to cleanly remove the brown paper, barring him from the prize that lay underneath. I watched the grim spectacle of the doctor using his sharp nails like some kind of organic letter opener, and then greedily scooping up the books in his hands, flicking through their contents with the hungry gaze of a wild predator. Happy with this lot, he turned to me, and without even looking me in the eye, withdrew a folded check from his waistcoat pocket and handed it to me. I unfolded it, and was once again taken aback by the amount written upon it along with my name, and quickly placed it in the top drawer of my study desk with an obvious, avaricious celerity. Our business seemingly concluded, I regained my senses and offered the doctor some refreshment, which he took thankfully, as he singled out a seat in my lounge with great effort, lowering his mummified body down onto it. As I poured us both a cup of tea, he continued to plumb through his new acquisitions with a look of pure joy. It was a look that seemed out of place, and it was disturbing to see it grow upon his cold, rigid face. We talked at length for several hours, during which time he made several inquiries as to where I had acquired my collection, and I felt that he was trying his best to gauge just how much I knew about it. Being one of the world's worst liars, I couldn't bring myself to deceive the man who had given me such a huge